say the simplest of things there. Hold on a second. So you're darkly visible to the world. It's a dark
I like that this is next to me.
Yeah, I know, right? It wasn't planted.
No, I've heard about that. You should write a death book. Sorry.
So, okay, thank you all for coming out. The book is Night Train to Odesa, covering the human cost of Russia's war. And doesn't have to be any more specific than that. It's a pretty universal idea. So Jen Stout, Scottish born, went to Moscow to do some journalism and ended up heading for Kiev, where she's done a lot of work. So this book came out in hardcover last year and has gone to paperback just now. And she'll give you an overview of it, okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Us.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for coming, and thank you to my lovely family for putting me up and sorting this out. And I came to know Eric because of my friend Zarina Zabriskie, a mutual friend. Zarina is a brilliant reporter. She lived here for a while, and now she's in Kherson. I don't know any other reporters who have been so consistently in such incredible danger just to report on what's happening there. So I would encourage you to look up her work. She's Zarina Zabriskie. So this is my first time in the US. I'm kind of on a whirlwind tour. It's been amazing. And next I head to Chicago and Detroit and Dallas, and then back to DC, and then finally back to Scotland, and probably back to Ukraine shortly after that. I'm going to just run you through the kind of story of the book, some of the stories of the people that I met, and a kind of overview of the places, because the book is very much about places that have just bowled me over. And then we'll do some questions. And I could do a wee reading as well if you want. So we'll start off. The book actually starts in Russia, which I like to say is appropriate because Russia started it. I had been trying to go to Russia all of my life, really, since I was 15, and I studied Russian in school in Shetland, which is a pretty unusual choice, and now actually impossible. They've taken it off the curriculum years ago. I don't know why it grabbed me, but it did. I just loved Russian language. It was like I knew it in a past life. And I wanted to be a foreign correspondent because I was reading Martha Gellhorn and I was reading Anna Politkovskaya, and she was a really brilliant investigative and war reporter in Russia. They killed her in 2006. And I read all her work, and I read her justification of going back to a war zone again. And she didn't have any kind of saviour complex, which people sometimes do. You know, she just said, it's very straightforward. I have the tools, I have the knowledge, I have the platform, I have a duty to go and do this. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do for some reason. So when I got to Russia, I'd been a couple of times before, but this was me going for a good 9 months. It was going to be 3 months of study and 6 months of internship. And very, very naively, I was thinking that I would do my internship at Novaya Gazeta, the pioneering investigative newspaper where Anna Politkovskaya had worked. And the editor, Dmitry Muratov, won the Nobel Prize recently. Nobody really wanted to have a Western journalist sort of poking their nose around and associating with them and trying to work on the staff, so that didn't really work out. But I was just about to start on the Moscow Times when the full-scale invasion happens, the 24th February. I was, unfortunately, in the middle of Siberia, and I mean right in the heart of Siberia, Gorno-Altaysk. It's on the border with Kazakhstan and China and Mongolia. And it had taken 9 hours to fly there from Moscow overnight. So we emerged onto tarmac barely, with this tiny airport surrounded by mountains and snow, and turned on our phones, kind of blinking. And it was all of my friends in Kharkiv saying, it started, they're dropping bombs on us. And I remember just feeling kind of frozen to the spot, surrounded by all this snow and ice, and thinking, oh my God, we have to get out of this country, like right now, like we need to get back on that plane. And it took a few days, but the programme was pulled and we were rushed back to Moscow, and I got to Vienna. I didn't want to go home, that would have been rubbish, so I thought I would go to Romania and just try my luck at freelancing, because I'd left my job at the BBC to do this, so I was unemployed and fairly penniless. And I'd never covered a war before, so I didn't want to wade into it, green and getting in the way. And Romania was the choice. I had a friend from Fair Isle, the island that I come from, with a population of about 52. she had been the nurse and she lived in Romania, and she was tapped into that whole massive network. There was a huge civic network of people all over Europe, getting people out of Ukraine, booking them flights, getting supplies in, getting supplies to the army. It was this huge kind of, I mean, it's still going. And part of the reason why Ukraine's been able to continue is that movement both within Ukraine and out with it. And she said, right, the place to go if you want to be a foreign correspondent but you don't have any employment is where everybody else isn't. And that was Izacha, where the red pin is. I knew nothing about this place, very little about Romania, frankly. I had to learn very quickly. There were many, as you can see on that map, this is where people were heading. There were huge numbers of people heading out into European countries, some of them staying, not huge numbers. They would often go on a bit further, some to the UK, some to the US. And this border crossing, Izacha, was where people were coming from the south of Ukraine, so perhaps Mariupol, but especially Odesa, Izmail, Mykolaiv. And that meant that they spoke Russian, by and large, because lots of Ukrainians speak Russian. Doesn't make them Russian. And I can speak Russian, so off I went. I got to Bucharest, and she's like, I'll find you a lift with some guys. So off I go in with some people driving from Bucharest, and I stayed in a B&B for a few days and reported, and I thought, this is great, this is really, really interesting, and I'm going to stay here. So I've met some volunteers at the port, these Romanian guys. The volunteer effort there was incredible. Like, they did such a good job. I'll show you some of this. So every day people were coming across the Danube. This is the Danube, it's about a mile across, and this is a barge, and that's the transport. Usually it's a very quiet, sleepy port. There's hardly anything going on there. It's really quiet and quite poor part of Romania. But now, and this is a week into the full-scale invasion, so sort of early March, there was several thousand people coming every day, and you can see that a lot of them are, well, most of them are elderly or very young or women. And those are all the fire guys going in to help them with their luggage. A lot of these people are poor, and they have never ever left Ukraine, and they just did not know what the hell they were going to find, if they were going to be welcomed or turned away. They didn't know. And to be honest, like, there isn't the easiest history between Romania and Ukraine in that place. If you know some stuff about World War II, you will understand why. And they were met with such kindness, like with these fire guys going to help them with SIM cards and sandwiches and tea and places to stay and onward travel. It was really emotional, actually. It was really amazing to be witnessing all this, and in the middle of this, it was like, and Romanians kept saying to me, this is the real heart of Europe. This is like what Europe is supposed to mean. You know, progressive values, solidarity, working together. And yeah, it was incredible to be there. You can see these little fluffy toys. It was a really nice idea to put the fluffy toys for the kids, but they unfortunately put them on with what do you call those, like plastic ties that you tie people up with, and you just couldn't get them off. So if you can see this, this poor fireman is like hacking it off with a knife to the horrified child. He did get it in the end. Yeah, and there was some trucks coming over, but I mean, most of the traffic was really coming out of Ukraine. And then, you know, I was among the people who was going across that barge a few times, like just for a day with the people that I was working with. And then eventually, after I'd managed to get a little bit of conflict environment training, I went in to stay, and I went to Odesa. There were loads and loads of kids crossing, obviously, and they were given lots of absurd amounts of cuddly toys. And sometimes their parents would tell them what was happening, and sometimes they wouldn't, because they didn't want them to know. But I mean, kids are pretty clever. They kind of pick up on what's happening. I don't know if anyone remembers this. This word in Russian means children. And people were printing this off and sellotaping it to the back of their car in the hope that this flimsy bit of paper would stop a Russian sniper or a tank firing on their car, which they did all of the time on convoys, all of the time. And I was standing in the queue one day, like taking pictures. It's still in Romania. And it's, you know, if you're a journalist, you have to have a little bit of distance. You can't let everything upset you, but sometimes something just gets you, and it was the idea of this flimsy bit of paper just had me in tears. This is the welcome tent where people came through. There was obviously a lot of, when things are quite chaotic and there's a huge kind of civic network picking people up, there's a real big chance for trafficking and for abuse. But again, and the police were kind of involved in that. They were helping a little bit. They were doing their best. They were really overwhelmed. But also it was that volunteer network. So sometimes I'd be helping. There were some people I met, and I helped them get to Berlin to stay with a friend of mine. And one of the women with them had said, oh, I've been offered a lift with this guy. And then I could go to this big WhatsApp network and say, has anyone heard of this guy? And they were like, yeah, don't tell everyone not to get in the car with him. So it was real like mutual aid. It was anarchist. So Odesa, I had dreamed of seeing Odesa like all my life really, and I'd spent a lot of time walking the streets like Derivaskaya here on Google Street View when I was stuck in Shetland in my 20s, and here it was, still beautiful, covered in anti-tank obstacles. And I was indecently happy to be there, do you know? I'd really worried about the decision. I'd really gone over it quite a lot because I didn't, it's putting people who love you, it really worries them, obviously. And I had a lot of older people in the journalism trade say to me, "Oh, Jen, you're just being selfish and reckless and you need more experience to go to a conflict zone." And I would say, well, how does one acquire that experience without first doing it, And also, I think there was a perception that Ukraine was this kind of post-apocalyptic hellhole, which you might get from the news, and that's not because the news is biased. It's just because normal life continues is not news. And there was a bureau chief who said to me in Moscow, you mustn't go to Ukraine because that will be a terrible war. And I remember so well, she said, there will be nothing good there. There will be no good there. And she was so wrong, and I was so happy that she was wrong because there was tons of good. One of these pictures is 1941, and the other is 2022. That's the Opera Hall in Odesa. People were very quick to make the analogy. So there was a little nickname for the Russians, rashisti, which they really hated. So it was like Russian fascist or Russian racist sometimes. But yeah, they're occupiers, invaders, aggressors. Odesan humour. Mama is the nickname for the city. Odesa is a port city. It used to be a very Jewish city, and it has a kind of Odesan slang, which is quite hard to understand if you're from Scotland. And the nickname for Odesa is Mama. And they said, this is, if anyone touches Mama, then she'll drown them. And it's a reference to the Moskva cruiser, the flagship of the Russian fleet, which was sunk briefly just a few days before that with a Neptune missile in one of the most astounding, deft things that the Ukrainians have done so far. And before that, this huge gunship had all its guns trained on the city. So I mean, people were looking out of their windows and seeing this massive threat. And Odesa there was a risk of it being encircled from the land if they broke through at Mykolaiv, from the sea, from the Black Sea Fleet, which is now gone, and from Transnistria, because of course Moldova is still partially occupied by Russian peacekeeping forces, and they're in pretty bad shape, but they are there. So there was this big threat, as people would constantly text me and remind me that I should get out of Odesa because it was going to be encircled. It wasn't, and it still hasn't been. And there was, of course, lots of normal life. This is Olya and Tolia selling their fermented goods, a thing of which I am a big fan, so I was very, very happy. So I was doing kind of colour pieces for a newspaper. I was writing about Privoz Market, which is huge and has very varied produce. This is, down on the Black Sea, it's so warm, and they grow grapes and they grow fruit, the likes of which I've never seen, and it's an incredibly productive, beautiful, vibrant place. And Odesa's just wild. It's really fun, even at this time. And there was this happening. So this was a missile strike into a block of flats. It killed 3 women of the same family, a baby girl and her mother and her grandmother. They hid in the bathroom, as they're advised to do, to have 2 walls between you. So a man called Alexander in what was his flat. So it was a couple of days after the strike. I'd gone back. When the strike happened, I was in a cafe doing some work, and you obviously heard it and felt it, and it's not permitted to report on the location of a strike before the authorities have confirmed it, because it allows Russia to correct their aim. But it's pretty obvious because you just follow the big plume of smoke. So I'd gone there to report and spent, about 6 hours until it got dark just reporting there. Which meant that the newspaper in Scotland, the Sunday Post, not the sexiest title, right? But our other newspapers, which used to be quite famous, the Herald, the Scotsman, they're such shadows of their former selves that they don't have any foreign correspondence left at all. Scotland has no foreign correspondence on the staff whatsoever. And much as, in America, you used to have lots of regional titles and state titles with correspondence all over the world, and that's all, as far as I understand, that's kind of declined as well. So they had, and it just in time to hold the front, but genuinely held the front page and say, here's our, on-the-ground report from the site of a missile strike in Odesa for the Sunday newspaper. And that, you have to hope that people see that and understand that having someone on the ground is worth so much more than just agency copy that everyone has, nothing wrong with agency copy, but to have a Scot on the ground telling these stories to other Scots, I think is really valuable. We share the same frames of reference. We should be there, but nobody will hire us. In Odesa, I also went to territorial defence bases to interview soldiers. There had been like massive queues of people outside these bases in the first few weeks. Everyone just desperate to sign up and protect their city. I mean, a lot of people in Ukraine of a certain age would have basic military training anyway, perhaps from Soviet times. They were in the Soviet army, so it wasn't kind of starting from scratch. But they were very much taken by surprise, as we all were. I don't know about you guys, but I remember when I was in Moscow and the US and UK intelligence forces were doing that unprecedented thing of warning us what was going to happen. And a lot of people said, oh, you're stirring it up, you know. No, they weren't. They were telling the truth. And what the hell did we think they were doing with 150,000 troops on the border anyway? I went to Mykolaiv once I had found a flak jacket, which is quite hard to find if you are quite small, because they're all made for gigantic men. And if they're too big, then they don't protect you. So that was a bit of a struggle, and still is for a lot of women, actually, in the army and journalists. Mykolaiv is a port city. It's where the Moskva cruiser was actually produced. I like ports, so I was happy to go there. This is the council HQ, like local council, I guess regional council kind of thing. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be here. And Russia fired a rocket into this on the 7th of March, just before 9 in the morning, so when all the employees were gathering with their cups of coffee, straight into the foyer, and killed nearly 40 people. And this is the national kind of symbol of Ukraine, the trident, and it had been on the top of that building, and it had flown down in the explosion and just sort of nestled in the grass, untouched. I thought this is quite very symbolic. These are the offices of people. I mean, one of the weird things about photographing the remnants, what's left behind of explosions, is how some things get completely preserved and some things are completely destroyed. So you get these weird glimpses into apartments and office blocks like this. And that's the guy in the army showing us around. This is the foyer where all those people had been. This may work. Yeah. Oh yeah. No one giving a fig. Yeah, if the air raid siren goes off so many times a day, and often it's for something that's flying over your head to another part of Ukraine, often it's for like there's a training exercise, if you went to the basement all the time, you get nothing done. So people kind of get on with their lives. There's also a lot of Telegram channels you can check to see what kind of threat it is. I don't know how these guys get their information, but if it's like Shahids, you've got a certain amount of time because they're really slow. The Shahid drones. If it's a cruise missile, like you can get underground quite quickly. And part of a journalist's job is to go and bother people when they're having a nice Sunday afternoon. And there was these two guys who were just, I went to try and talk to them. People, they have a lot of chess outside in Ukraine. It's really lovely. And this is in Chestnut Square. And I went to talk to these guys and I'm like, I'm really sorry, I'm just wondering how life is. And they're like, what? Leave us alone. What? Everything's fine. This square was actually hit a few months later, so I mean it's arbitrary and it's hard to predict, but people just get on with normal life because you have to, and so would we. This is evidence of cluster bombs, used very frequently on residential areas in Ukraine. You see the little little bomblets, and on the floor they look like starbursts. It's really easy to spot when they've been doing that. And these were villages just outside Mykolaiv, where the army had, for some reason, bombed it very heavily with aerial bombs in the beginning of the war, which are incredibly destructive, really big radius. So you get stuff like this. That was a cherry tree. I include this to show how beautiful and peaceful this was. There's vineyards everywhere, like people very carefully tend their gardens. I had so many Ukrainians would say, when I would interview them, they'd say, they just wanted to shout about Russia, you know, and they'd say, what have they liberated us from? Our peaceful, happy lives. And a bone grater, just for scale. This is a garden with spring onions, for it was spring. It's just after Easter. And my colleague Chleb. After a few weeks in Odesa, I decided to go to Kharkiv. Kharkiv is very far away because Ukraine is very big, which I think people forget. But luckily there is Ukrzaliznica, the fantastic train service, which will get you anywhere for like £15, and you get a bed and bed linen and a cup of tea, sometimes food. It's if you're from the UK, this is kind of wild. So Kharkiv is in the northeast. You can see it's really close to the border. It's less than 20 miles from the border with Russia, which is very unfortunate. So they can send a missile in and the air raid siren will not have time to go off because it's about a 30-second trajectory into the city, which they were doing an awful lot. And you've probably seen images of what was happening to Kharkiv at that time. They had really gone for it. One of the funny things that I discovered is that wherever you are, there's somewhere worse, and that your risk level will change accordingly, which makes it, when you've done that for quite a while, it becomes quite hard to explain your reasoning to people back home who haven't changed their risk level at all. So when I was in Romania and I was going to go to Ukraine, lots of people said that's insane, you can't do that. And I get to Odesa and like it's largely fine. The first day I was at a birthday party, you could hang out in a bar. Then I'm in Odesa and I say I'm going to go to Kharkiv, and everyone in Odesa, including a boyfriend that I had there for a few weeks, says you cannot go to Kharkiv because it doesn't exist anymore. I'm like, no, it does, and you can get a train every night actually. And granted, like there was no one else on the train, but it was running. And then in Kharkiv, they'd say, well, look, so here on the map you can see Donetsk and Luhansk. So this is what's often called Donbass, which is a short for coal basin actually. And near there's a city called Kramatorsk, which is not occupied, hasn't been. And when I was in Kharkiv, I would say, okay, well, maybe next I go to Kramatorsk. And in Kharkiv, they say, oh my God, Boże moi, you cannot go to Kramatorsk. It's way too dangerous. In Kramatorsk, you get there, and it's worse, but it's manageable. And you say, well, I think I'm going to go closer to the front lines. And everyone says the same thing again. Once you get to the front lines, there's always somewhere worse. There's always somewhere worse. And you adjust your level of risk accordingly and plod on. And if you do it for too long, obviously your level of risk becomes insane. And, I met people who've been doing this a long time in lots and lots of war zones, and what they considered fine was, to me, completely mad. This is what they did to Kharkiv. Beautiful, beautiful city. It's got an incredible mix of architectural styles, Kharkiv. Like, you can read its history in the buildings. And I have loved it since I set foot in it in 2018, when I got a job at the BBC, and it was the first time I had any disposable income, and I thought, oh, what do people do when they have jobs? I guess they go on holiday. Let's go on holiday. And I went to Kharkiv in November alone, and it was great. It's a huge city. It's 1.3 million, or it was. It's still about 1 million. It's heavily industrial, so the tractor factory, and they split the atom here the first time in the Soviet Union. It's also got like 9 at least universities, so it was a huge centre for learning and a real student city with a sense of like ideas and flux and change, whereas Kiev and like certainly Lviv can feel quite staid, I'd say. So I always loved Kharkiv, and it's kind of the underdog, because it's in the east and it used to be quite a Russian speaking city. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true now, but people, when you talk about like the real Ukraine, there'd be a sense that that's maybe the west of Ukraine or Kiev. And I would hit back and say that's very much Kharkiv. At this time, this is early May 22, so the blue is Ukrainian. They had pushed the Russians back from Kharkiv. Before that, they'd been so close they could fire artillery straight into the northern district, into blocks of flats, which they were doing on an hourly basis. They pushed them back all the way, almost to the border. So the city was a little bit safer. Obviously not very safe. This was the regional headquarters that they'd bombed on the 3rd of March with a missile. Luckily they're crap shots and they missed a little bit, so it just damaged the facade. But you could go down into the basement and pick among the ruins. It was full of crockery and kitchen stuff. And these are my colleagues I was working with. This is the scorch marks from, there was a huge fireball, because I saw the kind of CCTV video of this when I was in Vienna airport. I was talking to a Ukrainian and she was in tears and showed me this video. And of course, and she was from Kharkiv, just we're both standing in this queue in Vienna airport, desperately wanting to both be in Kharkiv, because your heart is there when your friends are all there, and it's so horrific. There's a really great bit that Quentin Somerville, the BBC reporter, a fellow Scot and a foreign correspondent, but he's BBC, so don't count. He did lots of reports from Kharkiv around this time. He's a brilliant war reporter, and he said this brilliant line. He said, "If this doesn't look familiar to you, you're not paying attention." And he was referring to the fact that the commanders, the fighter planes, the bomber jets doing this to this city were the same that did it to Grozny and to Aleppo. And for the same reason, it's terrorism. It's supposed to terrorise the population and make them give up. Like, these aren't military targets. This was a cafe and a record shop. It was a hipster hangout. It's purely to terrorise people, and they choose the wrong people with Ukrainians. I mean, geez. And it's a really interesting question about this war, is whether, you know, Putin and his leadership seem to genuinely think that they would be welcomed, their troops would be welcomed with open arms and flowers, and they were not. And the FSB being so deeply infiltrated into Ukrainian society for so long, either they were doing a very bad job and didn't know what Ukrainians actually thought, which, you know, one drinking session around a kitchen table would have told them, or they were too scared to tell, you know, Putin, same as people were too scared to tell Stalin the truth. I'm not sure which is more catastrophic for the Russian Empire. Nursery schools, blocks of flats, people living in basements. This is Yulia and Misha in Saltivka in the north of Kharkiv. I went back to see her last year, and they're still pretty much living like this. And that's just outside their flat. And down in the metro nearby, we had to go and shelter there because there was quite a lot of incoming. People were living in the trains at this point, but they're also, as you can see, they're living on the platforms. They've got a really extensive and excellent metro system, which is a great bomb shelter. Just outside Kharkiv were villages that had been liberated not long before that. This is a Russian tank, no more. And this village was called Vilhivka. I do not know why someone wrote Yoda on it in Russian. It's one of the many mysteries. And the mysteries kind of, you know, you're going in after, this is about a week or so after really heavy fighting. So they've removed like most of the corpses, but everything else is kind of lying there. There's a helicopter just over this hill. And you're just picking around, like, trying to piece together what might have happened. But really, a lot of the time, all you can do is describe what you see in front of you. For instance, this school, this is Vilhivka High School. If you go on YouTube, you can find their prom, where they all the kids stand outside, talk about, and they sort of graduate by giving each other flowers. It's really sweet, and they all like love their school, and they're all going on to bigger life. And you can see the school as it was, not like this. So I use this example because in the gym hall, which had a big hole in the roof and some unexploded ordnance, which I shouldn't have been so close to, in the corner there. I'd been told that this was, by the Ukrainians with me, that this was where the Russians had held out for a couple of weeks, made a base. And you could tell that they had been Russians because of all their stuff was everywhere. And also all the like empty bottles, always a good sign of Russians, and like really ancient gas masks and like tin helmets from like World War One. Like, I'm sure not tin, but you know, just like ancient crappy stuff, right? Ukrainians have better stuff, but it's often quite mismatched because they're badly funded as well, but for different reasons. But then got into this gym hall, and I'm digging around, trying not to touch that, and realised that a lot of that stuff, the uniforms, the fatigues, the cigarette boxes, everything, the books, they're all Ukrainian. And I'm like, hey, I think there's a bit more to this story. And they conceded that I might be right, like both sides had used this as a holdout at some point. But yeah, all you can do is say what you see at certain points. It's quite hard, you know. If I'd gone to the military administration and been like, I'm just wondering what happened in that school, like, you know, they've got other stuff to do. But one thing I did try and find out in this village, this is what I was writing up at the time, just an example of that in the Sunday Post, God bless them. In the village, we kept talking to people who mentioned that during Russian occupation, which had lasted 6 weeks, no gas, no electricity, constant shelling, and like crazy drunk Russians at your door trying to fight you and shoot you. And they described what had happened, and they kept referring to all the people who hadn't come back. And a lot of people were really traumatized, obviously, and a lot of people were really scared because they thought the Russians might come back and take the land, and then if they'd spoken to me and in a newspaper, they would be in a lot of trouble. And it's, you know, I think that's why you should work as a journalist for quite a while before you do this kind of reporting, because you're really like, you have a lot of responsibility for how you handle people and how you manage them and their expectations. Anyway, this guy was happy to talk to me, and he described how the Russians had one morning, lunchtime, knocked on every door, said there's going to be an airstrike, we're going to do a big airstrike, so we're taking you to safety. And they led all the people down this track. I think there's a picture of it. And they got to the neighbouring village, and he sort of smelt a rat, thought something was maybe up. So we took him and his grandchildren. He's a really nice guy, as you can see from that picture. He's a really sweet man. Him and his grandchildren, and he hid them in the garden of someone in the village. And he watched as all the other villagers were loaded not onto buses, but onto military trucks, like open back, you know, UMAs, And it turned out they were driven straight over the border, which is a war crime. Now, there's a question of whether the Russian soldiers doing that on the ground they might not know all the details of the Geneva Convention. And they might have, it's very normal in that region to go to Russia previously. It was really, people cross the border all the time, lots of trade, big markets, and they have family there. But the commanders certainly would have known that they shouldn't be doing that. And they did trick people by telling them there was an airstrike. There was never an airstrike. And Nikolai, this guy, was correct. So I wrote this up as best I could. You really need a team of investigative reporters, but you need that team in every single village in Ukraine because of the things the Russians have done, and the list of war crimes is so extensive, like stealing thousands of children. A lot of the people in this village were just scared about the winter, so this old lady had a massive hole in her wall and it was going to get cold and she didn't have any gas. Yeah. Back in Kharkiv. This is a bunker, as you can see, but it's also a recording studio, and they'd combined 2 recording studios because one of them was flooded. And they were live streaming this concert in order to raise money for the army. And this was just what everyone was doing. And actually, for my friends in Kharkiv who were kind of LGBT activists, writers, poets, they'd been doing this stuff, raising money for the army, since 2014. And they'd had to rely on some pretty unsavoury people to do that, because in 2014 the Ukrainian army was too weak and underfunded to fight back against the initial invasion by Russia. And so it was down to battalions like Azov, who come from Kharkiv, come from football hooligan sides in Kharkiv, and battalions called things like Freikorps. Apparently it's a joke. But yeah, friends of mine would say, at the time, we're raising money for these guys because it's better than Russian occupation. And that is a decision that none of us have ever had to make, I hope. Certainly I've never had to choose between some homegrown little fash who were into runes and tattoos of wolves and hating the gays, and an occupying army that will have you on a blacklist and will torture and kill you and probably your family. Who do you choose? And I think that's all that stuff is massively oversimplified in the West and not well understood. Anyway, here in the bunker, they're live streaming and they're raising money for the army. And to me, the army, that word, would always be like this distant state institution, which I was reasonably opposed to, because growing up, I would associate the army with Iraq and Northern Ireland and other colonial exploits, and it was easy to be against it in a kind of knee-jerk, simple way. I wasn't a pacifist because I just got quite obsessed with the Spanish Civil War, and I understand, interested in the Middle East, and I understand the right to self-defence. But yeah, I'd never had to think about what would happen in my town if we were invaded. And so here in this bunker, they were raising money for night vision goggles so that guy's brother, the guitarist, his brother, who's fighting a few miles away to keep the Russians out of the city so that we can sit in that bunker and read poetry and have a nice time. That's the army. It's not distant, it's people's family, and it's not very far away. And they're raising money for night vision goggles in the hope that his brother doesn't get shot by a Russian sniper. And it was one of the many times in Ukraine I had to sit back and think, ooh, what have I actually thought about all my life? And maybe it's changing quite radically, and maybe that's overdue. It was my friend Ivana raising money to buy equipment to find people under the rubble. This is the fire service, very gratefully receiving this equipment from Finland. But it was way too late. So many people had died under the rubble in these blocks of flats because people like her were having to fundraise and get this stuff from Finland. After a while, I'd been home, I went back and I had some frontline training, hostile environment training, and so I did some more frontline reporting like this. This is right on the border with Russia, north of Kharkiv, with a very young unit of people, mostly IT wizards. Everyone in Ukraine is an IT wizard, and an air steward, that big guy, and a chemistry PhD student, and they were assembling drones with Starlink. This is Starlink in operation, and bomber drones as well. So this is Vlada Chernich. She was 28, she was a chemistry student, and she had begged this brigade to take her, begged them for so long, and the commander had given in, gone to get her from her village, and it turned out she was a crack shot. She was the first woman in their field section of that brigade, and a drone pilot, and a medic, and she was killed 3 weeks after I took this picture. I went down to Kramatorsk in a tiny car with my crazy friend. A lot of war journalists are getting around in Ukraine with Ukrainian friends, traveling maybe with their. Even you say you're a journalist, but if you're traveling with volunteers who are helping the army, it's kind of easier to get access. Whereas if you're like CNN, you know, you've got your Jeep and your fixer and your security and hotels and other nice things, food, you know, insurance. But this was Kramatorsk. It's become the de facto capital of Donetsk Oblast since the occupation of Donetsk city in 2014. I really like Kramatorsk. It's like a proper steel city, like Sheffield was. You know, there's like smokestacks, grit, and people are working class and they're really direct and cool. And I was interviewing people partly for a story about these Jeeps. So if you notice something funny about this Jeep, can anyone figure it out? That it's a right-hand drive. So I had gone to Ukraine this time. I really hate flying, and like the trek in from Poland is a bit of a pain. So someone has said, "Do you want to come with this like Jeep convoy? We're driving all these really old pickup trucks from farms from Scotland to Ukraine." I was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, I like driving. That sounds fun, and it's free." And then I wanted to follow up, and we'd done the journey. My Jeep broke down like 5 times because if it's been on a farm all its life and then you drive it 1,600 miles, it's not going to go that well. And I'd met these guys because I wanted to go to the front line with them and do a story about how the front line in Ukraine is full of like right-hand drive Jeeps and what a beautiful symbol of solidarity between our two countries that is, blah, blah, blah. But they wouldn't let me. So I just talked to these guys and they look very sad. And that's because I'd asked them to. Devious journalists setting the news agenda, because Ukrainians would always smile in pictures. Like, these guys were hilarious. They were cracking me up all day. And my editor had often said, "Jen, it looks a bit odd when like all of the people you interview are kind of grinning." Like, it doesn't fit the story. And it's not, someone said it in a talk the other night, said, "Oh, like your editor wanted people to look sad so it would sell more papers." And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it's not some like grim conspiracy theory. It's literally just like it does look odd. And so I'd said to these guys, "Listen, I'm really sorry. I mean, my editor's kind of weird and he wants you to maybe look a bit sad." And so they'd done like, this is them doing exaggerated sad face. And every time I look at it, it really makes me laugh. They were really great fun. I hope they're doing okay. I went to Siversk. I shouldn't have gone to Siversk. It was much hairier than the place I was supposed to go to, but I got in the wrong convoy. And off we went in the mud to try and evacuate people from this town where, I mean, it is still in Ukrainian hands, but it's kind of surrounded by a pocket of Russian occupation. And life there is like just really grim, really grim. But people don't leave for lots of reasons. They don't leave because they've got a farm, they've got animals, they've got elderly parents, and also out of like very stubborn principles. So people would often say, as long as there's one Ukrainian left on this land, it is Ukraine. And I'm staying out of principle, and I don't care if they kill me, and they really meant it. And a lot of people have died because of that principle. There was so much shelling in Siversk, and the municipal services have kind of stopped working. So these are lots of makeshift graves near the hospital, where we then nearly got hit by shelling and had to hide in the basement for a while. And I include this because Donetsk and Donbass is very beautiful, and people don't know that. They think it's kind of grim, grey, post-industrial, Soviet, now war-torn. And the landscape is so varied. So out in the distance, you can see the Terikoni. Those are kind of shale deposits, like from mining. It's triangular, conical things. And the bright white is the chalk hills. So Donetsk is very rich, not just in coal, but in many, many minerals, in rare earths, indeed. And then there's lots of bits that are forested. There's lakes everywhere. And it's just gorgeous. It's such a beautiful place. And I just so hope that people will go there for tourism one day and not for this. I was often travelling with PEN Ukraine. So they're the Ukrainian chapter of PEN International. You can donate to them, and I thoroughly encourage you to do so. It's very easy online. They help writers. They help families of writers who've been killed by Russians, but they also replenish stocks in libraries where the Russians have burned all the books during occupation, because they so love doing that. And they also deliver jeeps to frontline areas, which is what they were doing in this picture. And I would just like tag along with them. We'd often be in a minibus with there was about 1.3 philosophers. We travelled to Liman, a railway junction, not much left of it. And stuff like this, littering the streets. This is a cluster bomb, Uragan rocket. I think we were there for 3 hours and I saw maybe 4 people. That's the railway station. Had been very grand. Liman was a really big industrial hub. You know, it was a big railway hub for getting coal in and out of Donbass. The story of Donbass is one of pure extraction. It's extractive capitalism, whether it's in the form of the Soviet Empire or not. And the Soviets weren't the first to go and tap that. It was the Welsh. So Donetsk city used to be called Hughesovka, after a man called Mr. Hughes, who was from Wales. And he built like tiny little English Welsh villages around for him and his guys to live in, and then all the workers obviously lived in slums. And then it was all expropriated off them, obviously, with the revolution and the occupation by Moscow. It's changing on there, but not on here. Okay. This is Bohorodichna, just nearby, where they bombed the convent church when people were sheltering in the basement and then occupied it, and all the Russian soldiers had lived in the courtyard and made an unholy mess. Like this. You can see their ration packs in the corner with a star on them. They have a lot of moronic symbols, like the Z and the star. Like, none of it really means anything, because it's not like they're communists. They don't believe in like the principle of communism. They just use these almost like elements of the past, but removed from any context, just as symbols of greatness. This is in Kiev, Maidan. The sea of flags is to mark all the soldiers who've died. You can see there's a lot that aren't Ukrainian. There's a hell of a lot of Georgians, Belarusians, a few Brits, Czechs, Americans, people who've gone to fight for a country that is not theirs, out of pure principle, which I think is incredible. And I put a lot of happiness in the book. It's not all miserable, because Ukraine is full of extraordinary things. And one day I was walking in Kiev and I heard an accordion. So I like ran down into the underpass in between. Really bad place to take pictures, I have to say, like strip lighting, very dark. And managed to get this shot of this couple. They were waltzing around and somebody was playing the accordion and a tambourine. And it was just so delightful. And I did some Shetland dancing and yeah. And there's a lot of this in the book, right? There's a lot of food and kids and dancing and music and singing, because that is life itself. And I've never found more of it than in Ukraine, to be honest. And I'll finish with this beautiful, beautiful Kiev, a beautiful European city. This is Maidan, the square where the Revolution of Dignity took place in 2012-13, for which they are still being punished, but of which Ukrainians are very, very proud. I feel like I was extraordinarily lucky to be in Ukraine at that time. And I learnt so much from the people there. I think in the news it's often quite abstract, right? It's about policy, it's about negotiations or whatever they're supposedly doing right now. And the kind of stories of everyday people and what they really believe in are left out. And those are the stories that I really wanted to tell in this book. All the stuff that I couldn't fit into my reporting is what I put into the book. And also a bit about me and where I was roaming around. So yeah, do read it, do ask me questions, and thank you so much for coming. I can read a little. I don't have my own book, but if someone would chuck me one, I could do that. Thanks. Cheers. I'll read you a wee bit from. Oh, sorry. I'll read you a wee bit from a train, from a night train. That seems appropriate. I use the night train so much, and not just for travelling, but it was really good to meet people and chat to them. And at this point, I had been in Kharkiv, reporting in that village with my friends Natalia and Zhenya. And I'd blown out my eardrum. I just didn't know it without going. So I was feeling kind of iffy. Anyway, I got on the train. So the problem with a late night train during curfew and blackout is probably obvious. The trains leave well after curfew descends, so you have to arrive hours early. I had enjoyed the sunset outside Kharkiv's magnificent train station. Its 2 towers and tall columns, the perfect stage for a flight of swallows playing in the evening light. But now it was dark. There was another hour to wait, and I was slumped down under my flak jacket and rucksack, half sitting against the wall of the dimly lit underpass. I looked around at my potential fellow passengers, hoping that I would not get stuck in the coupe, a 4-person compartment, with a snoring bloke, and I spotted 2 young women in uniform. I caught a few words of English from their murmured conversation. I bet I end up sharing with them, I thought. In the scrum down the tunnel, I lost them, but sure enough, they reappeared in my compartment. They were both quiet, thoughtful women. I had the last of a plastic bottle of cherry liqueur someone had given me and shared out the dregs. One woman was nicknamed Kasia, and she revealed cautiously that she was Belarusian. The way she talked about her role in this fight was poignant. Freedom for Ukraine would hopefully lead to freedom for her own country too. An end to the tyranny of Putin's puppet Lukashenko. Having joined the Ukrainian armed forces, she had essentially barred her own way home. Her mother was still there, and she said all this in a matter-of-fact way. She was doing what was necessary. No need for emotions. Lev, meanwhile, was Canadian. No one could mistake that accent. But I was staggered to hear how she'd arrived here. A full 10 years younger than me, she was already a seasoned army medic. At home in Canada years ago, she'd read about the Kurdish fight in Rojava, northern Syria, and about the feminist left-wing revolution taking place there under threat from ISIS. It said you could donate, or better, you could go and help as a medic, she recalled. And I was like, that's great, because I don't have any money. I guess I'll just go there. And she laughed. Lev had spent years in that grim fight against Islamic State, years which I couldn't imagine and which she didn't go into. When the war in Ukraine really kicked off, she said it was a natural choice to come and volunteer. She believed in the cause and had the skills they needed. The two women had been paired up because Kasia could translate, and you could tell they'd been spending all their time together under intense pressure. There was an invisible piece of string between them. I watched them from the opposite bunk during a lull in conversation. They were communicating without words. That kind of bond, that kind of closeness is hard won. Lev and I went to the end of the rocking carriage to smoke cigarettes in the chilly air. This had been banned on Ukrainian trains, which was annoying, and at first the conductor had flatly refused our request. But 10 minutes later she reappeared, whispered that we could smoke if no one saw us, and even winked. I told Lev briefly about the last few months and the reporting I was doing now. I mentioned the long rambling diary that I kept religiously, a compulsion to get everything down on paper before memory mushed it up or let it slip away. Yeah, I kept a diary for a while, she mused, but it got too dark. She'd lost a lot of good people in Syria, good friends. I looked at Lev, her face just visible. She dragged on her cigarette and it flared briefly in the dark. She looked so young, rosy cheeks and a shy smile. But there was something about her, something I couldn't pin down, which was making a deep impression on me, a stillness at her centre, a quiet certainty. I was thinking how embarrassingly awestruck I was by this person when she turned to me and said, "It's so brave what you're doing." I was completely taken aback. What I'm doing? Are you serious? You're a frontline medic. It's not even your own country. And she just smiled back, Buddha-like, nodding slowly. Thanks. Questions for me?
Where do you see the hope?
I think the hope is in the blunt fact of it is in the idea that they don't really have any choice, which sounds hopeless or grim, but it means they know that and they keep going, kind of regardless. And also in all the people I know they've done extraordinary things and they've changed, you know, especially women who've been able to do things that they would never have been able to do in peacetime, in roles that they would never have been allowed to fill. But yeah, look, I think there's less hope than there was. You know, in the beginning there was this it was like this giddy hope, and you can't sustain that for so long. It's kind of exhausting. I see some hope in Europe, or I place my hopes in Europe because now Europe is alone without the US, and it's well overdue that Europe started defending itself and paying for defence. I think I agree with President Trump on that point. Yeah, and I think with the Nordics, you know, the Scandi countries, Eastern Europe, Finland, Baltics, they understand. They understand what Russia is. They've been warning about this for a long time. And their defence spending is really high. And maybe a new kind of Europe will coalesce around that group of nations because Western Europe is just not getting it. Paul.
I don't have a question, I've got a statement, and that's that my takeaway from this quite wonderful talk is that we have a lot of responsibility in America. May not be very much we can do, but there's something, and let's do it. You know.
There's tons you can do. There's tons you can do. Yeah. Look, to be honest, man, I think like the era. Again, the thing that I grew up with and didn't realise how fragile and lucky it was, that the kind of peace and stability that was a bit of a hodgepodge, you know, with a lot of countries being sacrificed to the Soviet Union and Europe heavily dependent on America, that's finished. You know? But it doesn't mean that the progressive Europe that we built is finished. There's still plenty of people who believe in that. And down the line, America can have a new role in that world order. But yeah, I mean, at least this has brought to the forefront what we actually believe in. There was a great guy, Pavlo Kazanin, this journalist, and he's a soldier now, and he said at a book festival a while ago that he's fighting because he doesn't want, how did he put it, for the world to, so that the world would still know the difference between good and evil. Like, we shouldn't forget about that. And I'm not a Russophobe, right, but I do understand Russia, I think. And in Russia, the thing they say, you know, we say never again. In Russia, it's we can repeat. There's no one paying attention, you know? And now we know that. Yeah.
Oh, well, Russia's a huge, huge country.
It is.
And they use emigration into other countries to make an impression on them and move them.
Mm-hmm.
And my friends, this group of Latvian friends, every other year when there's an election, and it is declined to have Russian as a second official language,
Yeah.
they have a big party.
And
And that's the
Latvians
way
are
the Russians are moving things, and their language is even a weapon.
Yeah, of course. Pushkin is a weapon. You know, there was a lot, like, Ukrainians have been changing street names and pulling down Pushkin statues, and some people who do not understand and should look into it get very upset and say, oh my God, Pushkin is a poet. What did he ever do? It's so terrible. They hate Russia so much. You're like, right. But Pushkin was like a soft power weapon. He also never visited Kharkiv. Like, why would you have a statue to him? It was a Stalinist thing to turn Pushkin into a massive cult that everybody would worship. Just like the idea, so there's a lot of phrases in Russian that people would have, until recently, some older people would still hold true, which is like brotherly nations and the friendship of the peoples. You know, this idea that we're all together in this glorious Soviet Union, and that we're so anti-racist, we're so internationalist, and we're so peaceful. And none of those, well, I'm not going to delve into the history of the Soviet Union because we could be here all night. But the idea that everybody, that we're just a union of equal nations was never true. Particularly with Ukraine, where the Russian Empire, in various forms, had banned the Ukrainian language like so many times, had killed their intelligentsia, their priests, their peasants in the Holodomor. I mean, it's so clear. It's so clear all the way through history what they were doing. So that idea of brotherly nation is absurd, and so is the idea that Pushkin is sort of free of politics. So yeah, he's coming down. Yeah.
Sorry, not a question or response,
Sorry.
if that's okay. I think the brotherly nation thing is though a little more true just, among the population, like most people in the population. There's like a lot of family that's like mixed Ukrainian and Russian and stuff like that. But definitely not politically. Like
That is totally true. It's just that I don't think you can separate the two. So so there were so many things that happened in Odesa actually that I would illustrate this point with. And Odessa's often, stupidly, people will say that it's pro-Russian. It's not pro-Russian. I mean, Odesa, if anything, my friend from there would say Odessa's for Odessa, first and foremost. But I was at this birthday party, this woman, and yeah, they've all got Russian relatives. And it was her birthday. She was pleading with the younger guys at the party to not talk about the war and to try and keep talking to their Russian relatives. And they were saying, like, we've tried. They just tell us that we're fascist and they're coming to liberate us, or that the war isn't happening, or that we're bombing ourselves. So the Russians themselves have blown up those family ties. I mean, it's horrific. Like, every person I interviewed, I would ask, do you have family in Russia? They would mostly say yes, in the south and the east. And then I would say, are you still talking to them? And every single one said no. And it was the thing that broke their heart. Like, their family don't believe them. It's terrifying. Not surprising if you spend time in Russia and you speak to people. So yeah, I mean, all those family ties and the Russian language. I mean, so many people have switched to Ukrainian. I don't think there's any historical precedent for a population switching that fast and in such numbers. So the lie that always was that Stalinist maxim of brotherly people is kind of been exposed by all this. And now so many Ukrainians are on this kind of, I mean, really difficult, like, personal journey to look at their own family history and be like, oh, actually, Granny spoke Ukrainian, but then we were never allowed to. Or like, if you wanted to get ahead, you would only speak Russian. We'd sort of pretend that we never were Ukrainian. And I mean, imagining, like, trying to uncover all of that in your own family and your own head. If you grow up reading all Russian novels because that's what you're supposed to read, and never Ukrainian, and then you try and switch it all in the space of a few months because you realise that they've always been doing this and now they're really trying to kill you. It really makes Brotherly Nation like pretty hollow. But yeah, I do take your point. Yeah.
I was curious, I hadn't read the book yet, and I missed the first half of your interview, so I don't know how long you were in Russia.
I was
no,
go on.
That's
okay. I got to Russia in November 21, and I left a few days after the invasion.
So what happened to your connections there?
Most of them left. Some of them didn't. I tried to keep in touch with them. It did not go well. Yeah, people would just start, and like even before I left, people were starting to just repeat things from the TV when you were talking to them, and the TV there is nuts, you know. If we're looking for like evidence of genocidal intent, you would quote ministers from the TV, and they were just using phrases from that as if they weren't. And I'd say, "Can you use your own words?" And they just wouldn't. And I remember people saying things to me like, "You have your truth and we have ours," and then you're just screwed, aren't you? Like, where do you go from there? Peter Pomerantsev has this really good book, a really good phrase called "Nothing is true and everything is possible." It's about Moscow sort of during the boom years, but I mean it holds true for now. And I would change that. I would say nothing is true and therefore anything is possible. If you deny truth and you say, well, there's this and there's that, with that kind of depthless cynicism of the Soviet times, anything is possible, including like murdering all your neighbours and then denying that you did it. Yeah. Anyone else? Or any thoughts? You don't have to ask a question. Yeah.
I'm interested to see if you are thinking about parallels between what's happened in, well, I guess more in terms of Russia and the U.S. in terms of, authoritarianism and what you were just describing. What you were just describing also sounds a bit like Fox News and the simplistic kind of brainwashing of people.
I think one thing's really similar, and that's the victimhood narrative. So the Russians have a massive victimhood I mean, partly because of what was done to them in the 1990s, which I do think was very, very bad. But they think that their contribution to World War II isn't properly recognised, and that's a complicated question. But and you hear that in America today. We're being screwed. The world is making fun of us. The world is screwing us. We need to stand stronger, which is wild. It doesn't make any sense. But no, I mean, I think there's a lot of big differences, and the biggest one is that this country has institutions, and Russia never really did. Didn't really have. I mean, there was like the beginnings of an independent media in the 90s and the early 2000s, and that's really been snuffed out now, or quite literally in many cases. And it just didn't have the civic society and the institutional kind of framework that it needed. Because all of that, frankly, was overlooked in favour of just making them capitalist, and now they say, well, we tried to, but they were just so corrupt. Which is a disgusting thing to say about people who lost everything because you privatised their economy overnight. Beside the point. Yeah, I do think there are similarities. I think there's more similarities now. I think more about the 1930s, to be honest. And Spain and Germany. Yeah.
In response to your book, I love the way that you describe the vibrant cultural scene. The poets, the writers, the artists, the graffiti artists, the power of that. And I found a lot of hope in that. I had no idea that it was there, and it has always been there, even though I never knew anything about it. But I see hope going forward, because I think the word art is very important for keeping the people afloat.
Yeah, Ukrainians are cool. You know, they're really cool. Like, all the hipsters were starting to go to Kiev before the full-scale invasion instead of Berlin, because, like, Berlin's, like, so over, man. And and the art and cinema and photography and, like, whatever bit of art you're interested in, it was booming in some part of Ukraine. And that's so important now. Like, it's a difficult argument to make for some of my friends who are in that kind of sphere, to say to the authorities, hey, I know you're kind of busy, like, trying to keep people alive and help the army, but we really want to use this space for some, like, poetry thing or some, like, art therapy with kids. But by and large, they do win out because the authorities understand that that's kind of keeping people going. And poetry in Kharkiv is huge. Like, that's where Zhadan is, Sari Zhadan. A lot of my friends are poets, and they're like, when I was there last in January, they were ignoring the inauguration of Trump, which was global news. They were just not caring. And I went to a physical theatre performance and a new sculpture exhibition and a poetry launch of my friend Ivana, who you saw, and something else that was also great. And all of them were kind of people trying to describe and articulate what had been happening to them, and particularly the kind of absurdity, because it's really hard to describe everyday life when it's like normal, oh shit, normal. It's really hard to get that across to people when they've not experienced that, and to explain why you would just, like, ignore the air raid siren. So yeah, they're very busy doing all that stuff, and so many times I found myself in some, like, underground nightclub in Kharkiv where people were, and maybe here we'd just, like, or at home, I know that we would respond to this by just getting really wasted all the time, which is kind of what they did in World War II. But in Kharkiv, they have these evenings where everyone packs into a basement to discuss, like, the cultural values on which Ukraine is built and the progressive nation they're trying to build. And you're like, oh, guys, this is so sweet and earnest and amazing. Yeah, and I do often wonder, like, how we would measure up to that, how we would respond. And I would just add that for them, like, the whole point of the war is about that. So from like the Maidan Revolution, it's been about rejecting Russian rule, rejecting Russian corruption, and kind of cynicism and bribes, and, you know, that kind of society where things are cynical, and being very earnest, you know, and believing in things, in principles really, really strongly, and being not Russian. That's the whole thing, is being not Russian. Yeah.
You spoke before about how you changed your mind on a number of things. I'm just wondering, how has this changed you and your perception, not just of Ukraine, but the world, Europe,
Yeah.
and maybe yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. It gives you an idea of more what you can do. I think often you have a gut feeling that there's something that you should be doing, and a lot of people think it's insane, and so you don't do it for a long time, and you sit doing jobs that you find incredibly dull and frustrating, and then you do it, and it's great. I knew that I should be writing, and I knew that I should be, like, in the thick of things, and I knew that I'd be pretty good at being on the road all the time. I'm very bad at normal life. Terrible. So I try and avoid that as much as possible. About the world, I understand that you have to fight for things. I really, really do understand that. And I understand how fragile what we have is. Like, it's so unlikely that we'd have peace. And it's so unlikely that we'd have elements of freedom and democracy. Flawed as they may be, they're pretty good. And very, very hard won. And I think we got cynical and apathetic, and I hate that. I just find that so childish and boring. You know, when we're like, ugh, can't be bothered. So, but then, you know, you don't want to be like the person coming back being like, oh, you're so lucky, you should eat all your tea because someone's starving somewhere. Do you know? Like, you don't want to be all smug like that. But I probably have been at various points, because I think we're just really, really lucky. And we should fight for what we have here and in my country as well. Thanks. Yeah, I think, are we done? Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thanks, guys.